Collective, and Lal Salam to all. Thank you again for joining in remembering Gauri Lankesh and the ideas she left with us. Before we give all our undivided attention to our speaker for the evening, the journalist Shivani Kava, we should reflect on what this discussion is attempting to do, which is to highlight a few key ideas. One is Gauri Lankesh. One is that Gauri Lankesh's sharp articulation of truth and strong analysis of the present through a careful study of history was a formidable force that threatened regressive ideologies of the Sangh, which wants to uphold patriarchy, caste, and a hierarchical society that arbitrarily punishes minorities. Second, that these ideas and methods employed by Gauri remain a serious challenge to such a regressive force. And so we must see Gauri's martyrdom as part of a continuity of attempts to clamp down on anyone who employs these methods. And thirdly, building alliances of progressive forces using the ideas of Gauri and others like her is crucial in fighting the particular form of fascism that has been unraveling in our country for the past decade or so. Gauri Lankesh was an activist and a journalist. Her writings reflect a person who frequented her newsroom, the streets, and at times the police stations with the same resolve. She was the editor of Gauri Lankesh Patrike, where she used her cutting humor and precise language to dismantle the anti-people logic of the RSS and other similar Sangh Parivar outfits. This could be seen in a story from 2003, where she narrated about the time she and others from the Karnataka Communal Harmony Forum were arrested during a march in Chikmagalur when the police accidentally picked up some straddling Bajrang Dal members along with them, and how spending time in a common jail cell made these members question their choices. Or in 2015, when Dr. M.M. Kalburgi was martyred, as she wrote, the reason for Kalburgi's brutal killing is yet to be ascertained. However, the joy of the right-wing elements upon his demise shows how speaking against majoritarian beliefs is always dangerous. Or in her article, which was aptly titled Tughlaq Modi in 2000, which she wrote after the Modi government's demonetization fiasco in 2016. Of course, in less than a year from then, Gauri Lankesh was killed by gunmen outside her home. It has been 8 years since her killing. And since her death, we have seen a series of attacks against journalists, academics, and activists and students who stood up against injustice and oppression like her. This has been systematically carried out through various tactics, whether online threats and intimidation, surveillance, false charges implicating in so-called anti-national activities, endless incarceration, and as a consequence, institutional murder of the most vulnerable among the dissenting voices. That is, for example, Father Stan Swami and Professor G.N. Sai Baba, who we lost very recently. Just the previous week, we witnessed the unjust denial of bail to many young student activists like Umar Khalid, Gulfisha Fatima, and Sharji Imam, whose only crime has been doing what Gauri noted to be always dangerous, that is, speaking against majoritarian beliefs. These methods have also yielded one key result, which is large-scale suppression of meaningful journalism, as aligning with the Hindutva ideology has become the only viable means of existence for many news outlets. What is now known as Godi media is a full capitulation of mainstream news media to become the parrots of the state instead of being the force that raises critical questions. This impunity that the Sangh now enjoys has slowly expanded to its allies in other fronts. Only yesterday, the Delhi High Court has restrained journalists from publishing material that can defame Adani Enterprises, which is, as we know, the BJP RSS regime's favorite corporation. This was possible as the forces that kept such regressive developments in check have been gradually eroded. However, this is not to say that people working tirelessly towards a more progressive future do not exist anymore. This discussion itself will be proof of that. And that is why we are delighted to have Shivani Kawa speaking today regarding her experience as a journalist in Karnataka, which is a place we know where communalism and regional chauvinism have played a strong role in shaping everyday life for some time now. Shivani's most recent work on the Dharmasthala controversy perhaps is a point where a lot of these issues converge and where the freedom of press to uncover truth has faced repeated attacks. We hope that this discussion is something which allows for deeper understanding of the challenges that those who are fighting against oppression and regressive ideologies face. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade, for that introduction. I'll now pass it to Shivani, our speaker for the evening. Shivani is a journalist at the News Minute and has been covering issues of gender, caste, communalism, gender-based violence for about 3 years now. A lot of her recent work has been ground reportage of the Dharmasthala case in Karnataka. So she'll talk a bit about her experience and how it's been actually for journalists who've been covering all of this in the atmosphere that BJP RSS has created. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and thank you so much for having me here. I just want to give a disclaimer that this is the first time I'm actually doing this. So if at any point I do start sounding robotic, I want to apologize in advance. Like Anushri mentioned that, yes, I have been reporting on caste violence, communalism, and most recently the Dharmasthala mass burial case. Basically, stories that deal with power and its abuse, the power structures, which is to say that the challenges and the work I do is not very unique, but it's also part of the greater pattern that we see, that a lot of media organizations are facing today. But just as that we are gathered here today to remember Gauri Lankesh, I couldn't help but think about how much of her courage still looms over Karnataka and over Indian journalism itself, right? Like Gauri refused to stay silent, she refused to compromise, and she was targeted for the very same reasons. And remembering her is not just about honoring her work, according to me, but we also have to recognize the world that we live in today, because the battles that journalists faced 10 years ago are similar kind of battles that we're facing today as journalists that we're working. But coming to the pattern that I was talking about, that a lot of media organizations are facing today, is how Sangh Parivar and its affiliates are deeply uncomfortable with journalism. In fact, I'd say that they're afraid of journalists because journalism at its best can only do one thing that they cannot control, which is asking questions and exposing the truth that the kind of exposing the truth and the challenges, challenging the kind of narratives that they do want to propagate out there. Which brings me to the question, like the topic today about why the Sangh Parivar fears journalists so much. From conversations from my colleagues, because they've had more experience than I have, because I've only been doing this for the last 3 years, I would say there are many reasons, but I've kind of noted down 3 or 4 reasons why I think that the fear persists and what kind of fear Sangh Parivar, why they're scared of journalists. And the first and foremost is journalists break down the narrative that they have constructed over the years. It could be Hindu Khatre Mein Hai, about or how all Hindus are one, or how most of the violence is spontaneous, or even their definition of nationalism, right? So I feel one of the fears is this. And second would be accountability, because as journalists, we often ask questions about who incited the mob, who benefited from them, who gave the orders. And as we know, in Karnataka, at one point, we knew that coastal Karnataka was the Hindutva lab, but now we see slowly that changing, because that has moved towards the old Mysore region. We see mobs, cattle transporters being attacked, the people being attacked, a lot of people from the marginalized sections being attacked, or communal riots happening here and there. So people in power, what do they want? They want silence, right? And journalism does the right opposite of that. We interrupt that silence. So accountability is one of the major fears. The next is my favorite. It's the fear of memory. I feel the right wing thrives on amnesia. Like they would prefer that each atrocity should be forgotten after a few days. And I feel journalism creates a record of what happened in that particular year, on that particular day, and what really happened. And I say this because when I started out at the News Minute, I was also an ignorant person, because I remember asking one of my editors, why are we reporting this case? Because this, just like a similar case happened 2 days ago. Why are we reporting that? And I remember the editor was patient enough to explain it to me and tell me that as journalists, we're not just reporters, but we're also archiving history of what happened, on that particular day. How, because as journalists, we're also writing narratives, right? What happened from a different perspective. At the News Minute, we also the report the power dynamic in which incidents happen. So, cut to a year later, it was the Ayodhya temple inauguration, and we were doing a series on because during the 1990 to 1992, there were a lot of riots happening across India, and we know that a lot of people traveled to Ayodhya. But what at the News Minute we wanted to see, like, what was happening in South India. So gradually, like, each and every reporter was given assignments to look at their own states, and naturally I was given Karnataka, and I was a little bit overconfident because I come from coastal Karnataka, and I was like, yeah, of course, it's coastal Karnataka only. Most of the riots would have happened, not in any other part of the state. And to my surprise, when I went through the archives of Hindu and Deccan Herald newspapers from 1990 and 1992, I found that most of the riots did happen in Gulbarga, Davangere, Chenpatna, Bengaluru. And I was shocked because my assumption was wrong. And I naturally thought it would be coastal Karnataka. And surprising thing that I could see in the archives was that the newspaper clippings, the kind of reportage whenever a communal riot takes place, was no different from what we write today. How the authorities do the same things. They have the same tactics on controlling the crowd, or what the politician is going to come out and say one day after a riot takes place, or what are the actions they're going to take. So coming back to what why this was my favorite part is that Sangh Parivar does not like us remembering things, because they want to rewrite history. They want to create their own narrative. So what could be more dangerous to that is the fact that we remember, the fact that the memory of people remembering what had happened when a riot took place. And next, I would say, is the fear of local languages. Because often I was wondering, like, why were the regional reporters being attacked? And it just, like, then I was like, okay, fine. English media, they can dismiss it as saying Lutyens elite. But a Kannada journalist, a Hindi journalist, a Malayalam journalist, these are the people who can directly speak to the people who form their base, the right-wing base, right? And that's why regional journalists are the ones who often face even sharper intimidation. And yet, even when I say, like, I work out of Bangalore, is somebody speaking? So sorry. Okay, yeah. So I work out of Bangalore, and when I go reporting in different places, I know that I'm going to come back to Bangalore. But if I am somebody who's reporting from a district, I am of the constant fear because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have to stay here. I have to ensure my own safety and the people, my family and everybody else. So apart from regional reporters, it's the women journalists and women reporters who are attacked with an intensity that is both misogynistic and political. Like, it's not just our stories that they want to silence. It's the like I was saying, like, it's they don't just want to silence the stories that women reporters are writing, but it's also the idea that a woman is speaking out publicly. She's on the ground. She's asking you questions. And last but not the least fear would be the fear of global attention. because any kind of violence that happens can be spun domestically, right? Like, can you change the narrative and everything? But when journalists are ensuring that the world is watching, it dents the image that they have carefully cultivated of India as a democracy on the rise, which is why who report on these Hindutva issues critically are often branded as foreign agents or simply accused of being funded by China. So yeah, these fears are one of the reasons why so much energy they put into creating this kind of fear around journalism. And just like Akshay was mentioning, how like there are different fear tactics that they use, right? So yeah, first and foremost, and which is often visible, is the online trolling or the harassment. Because if you write critically about a communal violence or Hindutva politics, you're immediately an anti-national, anti-Hindu, urban Naxal, biased. And next one is my favorite because you're part of a conspiracy. I can't recall how many conspiracies I've been part of in the last 3 years. It's amazing. Like anything you report on, you're part of a bigger conspiracy. And right now, I'm part of a conspiracy to bring down a Hindu temple. Great. In fact, recently, one of the trolls on Twitter, because I was covering Dharmasthala case, said I should change my name from Shivani because Dharmasthala deity is a Shiva, and I'm such a disgrace to Shiva, and that I should change my name. It was one of the nicest things they said among all the things that I got. But again, these are not just random individuals on social media, right? Like they're coordinated campaigns. There are IT cells which are working overtime to attack you as a person and not just your story, your character, your credibility, and your very right to be a journalist. And especially in this climate, I get it. Like the older journalists probably are used to this, but the young reporters, the women reporters in particular, face the kind of abuse which is designed to wear them down in the long run, which might, make them think twice or thrice before even pitching an idea. And even if their idea does get accepted and they've done all the investigation, they would want to again think more of the consequences that might, occur after publishing the article, because it just doesn't end at publishing the article, right? That being said, I think small media organizations are doing a better job at protecting their reporters. I can only speak for the News Minutes because I think women-led organizations that way know about how can things, how you can articulate these things, how you can not react to these things, because at some point it's going to get to you and you also want to sit down and start replying to every troll out there, but that's not recommended. Now, coming to the second tactic, which is more subtler, and it happens inside the newsroom, which is the editorial hesitation. Like even the smaller ones, I'm not just talking about bigger newsrooms, because even smaller newsrooms, there's a constant weighing of the risk. Like, do we go ahead with the investigation? Do we change the headline? Do we publish the story at all? Because for independent media houses, these kind of risks are very high. Unlike the big organizations, I want to say Delhi-based networks, because they have their own legal teams, political clouds. But as small organizations, we do not have the resources to fight a defamation suit or injunctions. One injunction, one case can wipe out our months of work or even drain our newsroom's entire energy. Like now at News Minute, I know the postman here personally. Like he calls me every time we have a legal notice to say, Madam, letter bandide. I mean, that kind of letter, which is a legal notice has come. Can you come and sign it here? And if I am not there, if he's just because he comes in cycle and he'll ring it, and we're just wondering oh God, who did we write about? Who might this be? So we have this guessing game altogether. So, and the injunctions again, what we were talking about is that has been happening more often. Ex parte injunctions are being used to block articles even before we have published them, on just the suspicion that they might be defamatory someday. I mean, we're talking about censorship even before a story is being told. And we saw this when Prajwal Revanna sexual assault case came into light. Like media could not report on the videos that were leaked for 2 days because there was an existing ex parte injunction banning any defamatory reportage. Now, in our newsroom, I'm pretty sure other newsrooms as well, there's always a joke that if a politician has got an injunction, which means a CD is going to come out or a sex tape is going to come out. But jokes aside, it is a very dangerous tool at the end of the day. Like in Dharmasthala case, it went even further. They did not just stop at, they did not just stop future reporting. They tried to get about 8,000 links deleted. And even my own reports from 2023 on Saujanya murder case, we had to take it down because the endless legal notices they kept serving to our office. And even when you are not taking it down, they go and write to YouTube and Facebook asking them to take down your videos. So it does not stop at legal notices at all. And then, of course, there's one more tool, which is arrests and raid when none of these things work. And we've seen that happen in the last few years. And rightly, Akshay said, like, we've seen journalists being jailed. I'm going to talk about journalists here because I'm a journalist, activists who haven't gotten any bails. I mean, so what does these kind of incident do? Like two things, right? If a journalist is arrested, yes, they are punished. The individual is punished, but it is also sending a message to the rest of us. Like this could happen to you. And the whole point is that the fear is the message. And this fear works in ways that isn't always visible. It's not just the stories that are being published, punished. It's also about the stories that never see the light of the day. I know of reporters who work in different organizations who have done months of investigation and have solid backing to everything that they've written, but their stories, these organizations are never going to publish them because worrying about the consequences that might be there, not just legal, but also political. And not just that, like when you're on the ground as a journalist, there are sometimes you yourself censor yourself because you think the risks are too high. So that kind of invisible censorship is also a dangerous outcome of this climate, is what I feel. And when we look at all of this pattern, we see that this is happening again and again. Like it might not be in this, it might not be like they're using this kind of tool because there's always a new precedent that comes, right? But it's the same thing. It's online harassment. You can discredit the journalist. Legal cases, you drain the organization. Arrests, intimidate the community. And hesitation inside newsroom, make sure you're silencing the entire organization where they don't even feel like they should take up a topic or send their journalists on the ground. That's how easy it has become. So yes, the Sangh Parivar does fear journalists, and mostly it fears what will happen if ordinary people know. Ordinary people have access to truth. Ordinary people have an idea of what is actually happening on the ground, which is why they have invested so heavily in silencing us with money, with IT cells, with lawyers, with state machinery. In fact, like before joining this call, I was listening to a talk that was happening today in National College, Hindu Jagrana Vedike. The talk was about the enemy within. So they were saying the Hindus who are opposing the Hindutva, they're calling them the enemy within, the urban Naxals, and how they are they're a disgrace to the Hindu religion itself. It's one of my favorite pastimes. I just like to know what is happening, what are they discussing about. So yes, like they are investing in these kind of talks, and people, and they're very good orators, right? I mean, I got so hooked on it, like, wow, this is amazing. So these kind of heavy investment and resources they have at hand. So despite all of this, we have to remember that there are journalists who are still reporting. There are stories that are still getting written, and there are questions that are still being asked. So that kind of persistence to me is the real legacy of Gauri Lankesh. She did not believe in silence. She believed in confronting the fear and in speaking out even when it carried a cost. So I feel if we want to honor her today, we have to hold on to that lesson, that journalism is not just about reporting facts, but it's also about refusing to let fear dictate us or control us. Yeah, I think I've yapped too much now. Let me know if you have any questions. Yeah.
Thank you. That was so wonderful and interesting to listen to the all of the experiences and showing how like it affects journalists at every single step, and it affects everyone at every single step. But yes, do people have any questions? You can either unmute and ask. Yes, actually.
Hi, thank you, Shivani. That was great. It was very insightful to see what the present situation is for journalists. I have played few questions that I wanted to sort of bring up. One is in Karnataka. I mean, we know that currently it isn't the supposed right wing that is in power, but even despite that, we see various patterns which are very similar to what the Sangh Parivar carries out. One of them being a legislation that's being proposed of digital platforms and essentially a bill regarding digital platforms and fake news, which saw a particular kind of regressive framing. What do you see? I mean, considering that, like, you also work as a journalist primarily on digital platform, like, what do you see the implications of that will look like? And what should the response of the media be towards that? That is one question. Perhaps I can just add one more, and the other one is about the Masala case itself that you've been covering quite extensively. As it is a story that is continuously unfolding. What has been your experience on the ground facing the Hindu right in a place like Dharmasthala? And a question aside from that would be that this is also this particular case should we not see it in the context of other cases we've seen in religious institutions, like cases allegations of violence in Mata Amritanandamais in Kerala or in Isha Foundation? So how do you see that pattern? Thank you.
So coming to the fake news bill, that is something I have also reported on because I found that very interesting when I went through the draft bill. They had included that if you say anything against feminism or Sanatan beliefs, I never thought I would read such a sentence, with both these, like something like that. So, but I do remember that it was one of the draft bills, and then the government claimed that that was not the draft bill. It was a private bill which was circulated by the people saying that was the draft bill of the government. And the power of dissent and opposition, right? When so many people, so many media organizations reported on it, the government did put it on a back burner. So for now, it is on a back burner, and they're saying that that was not their idea. They had not put something like that. But it's not to forget that we did have a fake news unit among the government. When the Congress government came in 2023, Priyank Kharge himself wanted to lead it, and it did come into picture. But they haven't been doing much. But at some point, it is very similar to what the union government also brought in. And I think one of my editor in chief Dhanya was one of the people who actually filed a petition in the court. Among other people, she was also one of the petitioners who went to the court saying, you can't bring in something like this because government can't control news, and how are you framing what is fake news? So I'm guessing there's already too much criticism of the bill, and as in when the Congress government, and like you mentioned, it's not very different from what the BJP has been doing. And if I'm not wrong, I mean, there's this political observer and a journalist, Shiv Sundar, and if you talk to him, he'll tell you how Congress is just softer Hindutva, and everybody in Congress would probably want to be in RSS or the BJP. They're just the people who are believers themselves, but they're not part of the actual political system. So it's not much similar because the Congress government did promise to repeal some of the regressive laws that were brought by the BJP. And yesterday at the St. Mary's Feast, Siddaramaiah also said that he'll review the anti-conversion law. So they keep promising and then they keep going back on their words. So I can't comment much on that. But this bill definitely, once if they want to bring in again, I'm sure there will be dissent. It has happened once and people are obviously going to talk about it. So that is going to happen. And the Dharmasthala case, Sorry. There's so much happened in Dharmasthala case. Twists that nobody saw coming. And if we have to look at it parallelly, yes, at Hindu religious institutions, yes. But from what I understand, Dharmasthala is a little bit different. With the kind of power structure and the things it owes. Like today, DK Shiv Kumar at India Today Conclave said that it's an infighting between BJP and RSS. And this is something that we reported back in 2023 also. And that is something the locals will also tell you, that this is an infighting, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are going to win. Because on one hand, they are supporting Virendra Hegde, who's the administrator of Dharmasthala. On another hand, it's a Hindu man, Mahesh Shetty Timrodi, who's a former RSS man. He's the one leading protests against Virendra Hegde. So it's different factions of right wing who are fighting against each other. So on one hand, we know that they are pro Virendra Hegde. They're fighting against another man who does not want the temple to be part of, who does not want to be the temple to belong to a Jain administration. He wants it under government control. And BJP on a state level does not want temples to be under government control. So you look at the destruction tactics, right? They have, whenever it's convenient for them, they use different type of narratives to build. I think I've not answered your question properly, but yeah.
No, it was helpful. Thank you. I mean, it is interesting to talk about what within the right wing there is a kind of pull and push
Infighting.
happening, and that is, I mean, ideologically where that will lead our state to is also a question. But that is something that we can think of.
There's a question from Akarsh in the chat. How have courts responded to the harassment that journalists face, and have you observed any differences in the way that lower and higher courts deal with free speech issues or concerns about harassment?
I think so. There's always like appeal, right? And there are something that I have been seeing as a growing trend among the courts is that the higher court judges make the headlines. They always have this punchy things that they want to say that makes into the headline. But if you look at the court order, it's again it would be entirely different from what you want to hear from them. But on the free speech, I haven't come across much instances in Karnataka, apart from the part where the injunctions keep happening. So many people have gone to court to obtain injunctions against media organizations, and most of them happen in the lower level, which is the Bengaluru city civil courts. And high courts have also been notorious to give injunctions. But the appeal itself takes too long for media organizations to go and get it removed. It's a long process. I think one of the injunctions that we had, it took us like 2 or 3 years to actually get it vacated. And we're talking about like News Minute is a small organization. We have around 20 to 25 injunctions against us. And I remember I looked at data from 2013 to 2023 and mainstream media organizations. I remember they had as much as like 150 to 200 injunctions against them. So I don't think they're moving at a very fast pace as such. And even if you go to a higher court to get it vacated, it requires a lot of money, and a lot of media organizations do not want to go through that hassle because there's already so many other things to do, and smaller organizations do not have the resources to fund these kind of legal fees, because it's an expensive affair at the end of the day. So there are only two things you can do. One, you can despite the court order keep reporting on it, or you take down the old articles and hopefully they don't notice that you're reporting still. Or two, you just stop reporting on it. Like that's what happened in the Dharmasthala case. When the complainant made the claim in July, none of the Kannada mainstream media organizations took it up until the exhumation started, and one of the John Doe orders. John Doe is like they're not even naming the defendants. They're not even naming the media organizations. At least in ex parte injunctions, we were happy that, okay, our name is not there, we'll keep publishing. So John Doe order is like if you're anybody who's going to publish on YouTube, Instagram, anything defamatory against Dharmasthala or its administration or the family members. Again, I do not know how to define a family member because in different laws you have different definition for a family member. So it's very vague that way. And just to answer your questions, like not much comes out of it, and it is an expensive affair at the end of the day.
There's a question from Bharat, and then I will come to Malvika. Why North India media compared to South Indian media is a lot more aggressive in reporting agenda and propaganda of the right wing, and also compare South Indian people to the North Indian people when whatever they get report, whatever report they get in the media, they are a lot more serious. What is the reason behind it?
I think whoever controls the money controls the narrative. Most of the mainstream media organizations are from Delhi. Their money comes from Delhi, so the narrative comes from there, which is why, like you say, it is aggressive in reporting agenda and propaganda. But I don't think so. Equally, I can speak from Kannada media organizations; they are equally bad. They have their aggressive tactics, but also it depends on like who is funding their money, where it is coming from, right? At one point, they will be taking, you know, I don't think they take an ideological stance, but whoever is funding them, whichever political party is funding them, but most of the money does come from Delhi. They're Delhi based, so which is why I think the reportage is more aggressive and the seriousness, or I don't want to call it seriousness, but the narrative that they build. So whoever controls the money gets to control the narrative.
Malvika, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Shivani. So, the question I had was on the platforms that you choose to publish, right? So, the independent media heavily depends on big tech platforms like Instagram for reach, for sharing their stories compared to legacy media. But these platforms fail us, right, when push comes to shove, like either through government censorship or like self-censoring, and they do in the end align with the ruling class. So, for example, in case of the Palestinian genocide, Instagram has been censoring a lot of accounts. But I mean, ironically, a lot of the news I from Palestine has come to me through Instagram. So, is this something you think about? Is this something you consider? Say, what happens if you lose your social media reach, or say your account gets suspended? Like, is this something you think about?
Actually, yeah, losing my stories is something I think about every single day. That's why every time I publish something risky, I go on archive.org and I archive my stories because of these injunctions which ask us to delete our articles. I've started doing that. One of the practices that I do is preserve my story in case internet's only shut off, because I know of like so many small organizations which have stopped working and the website stops working, which means like entirety of the work is gone, right? But coming to Instagram and social media, yes, the heavy reliance on social media is true, but I think there's no other way of working around it. If you ask me, do I like appearing in front of a video and talking about things? No, I would rather like my work speak for itself. But nobody is reading articles anymore. Nobody has the patience or the time to go through a 5,000 word, let alone 1,000 word. No. So, which means I have to pack everything that I have in about 60 seconds and then ask people to read on it. And the heavy reliance, yes, on Instagram. And you're right, there have been times when videos get deleted or you get shadow banned. So that is something I do think about. But if you have any solutions for it in a way that media organizations can work around it, digital media organizations can work around it, I'm really open to that. I'm pretty sure we would be like really helpful, grateful that we have any other mode, because one of the reasons why I have to rely on Twitter as well, because most people moved away from Twitter, but we still had to do it because a lot of the audience is still on Twitter. Which means you have to, no matter what your ideology is or no matter what stance you want to take, these are the places where we have to promote our work, because they're too small and there's no other way that people are going to come to the website and read it. So, yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Vignesh. In recent years, it's the small media that often do very risky investigation. How do you think it's happening when the resources are the opposite? And what makes you and your journalists continue doing these risky stories?
Okay, you're absolutely right. The resources are very little, but also I can speak for the News Minute and some of the independent media organizations. We do depend on subscribers, and since last April, we have stopped, ads on our platform, which means we are totally ad free. We do not take money from any corporates, and people care about the work we do. At the end of the day, which is what keeps us going, that there are people out there who are willing to pay for your reportage, who are willing to send you on the ground to uncover a story. So, as long as there are subscribers who are ready to do that, I think we can happily say that I can continue being a reporter. And I cannot thank enough. I do have the privilege because I work at a small media organization. I am able to cover the Dharmasthala case, because if it was any other legacy media organization, they don't send their younger reporters, especially a woman, to cover such a high profile case. And I have been part of a lot of the high profile cases that have happened in Karnataka in the last 2 years. And that is only possible because I work at a small media organization. I do not want to call it small. A practice that I've kind of sworn to stop is we are an independent media organization. We may be small in number, but our work speaks for itself. So I'm only able to do it because of that, because of the editors that, push you to do this kind of reporting. And when things go bad, they are always there to make sure you are doing okay, and no story is above you, making sure you are safe. So I think this kind of news culture, this kind of newsroom culture is one of the reasons why journalists still continue to do things. And resources part is, yes, subscribers. Please subscribe to small independent media organizations wherever possible, because it does help a lot. It helps us in reporting, it helps us in buying equipments we need, it helps us just going. Yeah. I think Twisha has been wanting to ask a question.
Yes, yes. Trisha, go for it.
Thank you so much, Shivani. I think your experience and your kind of understanding of memory and archiving was really like useful to understand in this time and age. My question was also a little bit relevant to what Malvika was saying and also what you were saying, right? Like your fear of your stories disappearing, and looking at the protests that are happening currently in Nepal, where the government, decided to ban social media platforms, and luckily that got overturned. There is also this threat of losing what we have and what we remember because it relies on the internet. So bringing back what, like, Lankesh Patrike and Gauri Lankesh tabloids, and is there something you would like to say about like revolutionary publications, or like actually printing some form of what you're doing and what people are doing in uncovering these narratives and giving alternative narratives? What is the value in this time and age of having print tabloids and having printed kind of magazines, and what are the challenges that you see with something like this as a digital kind of platform?
I actually hadn't thought about this until we had this discussion. And also, I was speaking to one of my colleagues from the marketing team today, because we are going to have an event. It's called Media Rumble, which happens every year on October 3rd and 4th. And we were thinking of bringing our articles to life, which is getting them printed and showing people like this is our work. So that is when it occurred to me that if tomorrow I have to show to people this is the kind of work that I'm doing, and if one day internet stops working, I don't have anything much to do. And this is something I and also I think as digital news organization, we also have to ponder upon, like, what are other ways that we can ensure that our work remains when at a time there's so much of narrative building happening. And we've seen how narratives false narratives are used to push propaganda in certain ways. So I think this is something that news organizations should think, and that I will go back and take it to my newsroom and discuss with my editors about how we can revive our work in case the doomsday comes.
Shalom has a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for joining us. I just had a question about your reporting on caste and recent atrocities in Karnataka. A while back, I had read Rukmini S's work where she was looking at the surge in media coverage of sexual assault, incidents of sexual assault post Nirbhaya, and how it kind of gave the impression that there had been a rise in atrocities, whereas actually the number of atrocities had remained the same. It was just the media coverage that had increased. I wanted to ask about your own understanding of media coverage of caste in the state, of atrocities, and also of student suicides and harassment within educational institutions, and whether you think that, like, in terms of what kind of changes you've seen in the past couple of years, and compared to the actual figures, also if there's been a change in that or in the style of reporting.
Okay, I cannot answer about the student suicides because I haven't covered much of that, and I do not know the numbers or what was the data before that. The first question, wait, I thought of an answer. Can you repeat it?
No, just about the
Yes,
like it
yes,
feels like the media coverage has
yes,
increased.
yes. This is interesting because I remember asking my executive editor Sudipto, because we every year we go through NCRB data as a newsroom. Everybody's given topics about you cover this, you cover suicides, you cover this, and we discuss about what the numbers are like. Numbers are telling like the crime has increased. So he told me something that we should be happy as long as crimes are reported, which means that there is awareness in these places where people are aware that they have rights and they can go and file complaints, especially when it comes to caste atrocities. Because if the places with lowest numbers may not be the places where atrocities don't happen. These are the places where atrocities might happen in a higher number, but people are not aware or people are so scared to even go and report it. So, as to like media coverage of things, yes, I think that is a routine when it comes to media. Like even if it's a dog attack case, sorry, wrong example, but I'm just saying like you'll see a surge of reportage on dog attacks in a particular area. And if you see a report on sexual assault, like if you see one gruesome sexual assault incident, then media will only report on such kind of stories because that is how Google and SEO work. And as human beings, we also want to know about certain things, right? Because you've already found one template that works for you and people are reading about it. So how about you keep churning it as much as you can till people are bored of it? So that is one of the reasons why media reportage on similar incidents do occur often when like a crime of a large scale does happen. Did I answer your question? Because I think I forgot the second part.
No, thank you.
I also wanted to ask that about the Dharmasthala case, like BJP's response has obviously been to like twist this in a whole, you're tarnishing the temple and you're doing all of these things and that whole debate. But Congress's response has also been a lot of hesitation in pushing the case further. So, like, why is that the scene and how is that affecting the reportage that journalists are able to do? I feel like BJP has all maintained that yes, this is to tarnish the temple, and even in Congress, if you see the reactions are different. DK Shiv Kumar called it a conspiracy. Today, he called it an infighting between BJP and RSS. Whereas the Home Minister has been a little bit sensible, where he has not made a blanket statement because he's maintaining that the investigation is still on. How it has affected reporting since the beginning, it has affected the reporting, right? Like it didn't have to be political because the kind of legal measures they have brought in. Dharmasthala administration has gone to the courts to bring injunctions. Since then, there has been a sense of, there has been, media has been hesitant to report on things. I mean, if, TV9 is one of the news channels which reports on everything. So when TV9 Kannada does not report on Dharmasthala mass burial case until the day of exhumation, which is 1 month after the complaint was filed, we can only imagine like what kind of pressure the media must be under. So the political pressure
I'm sure that is there. I can't speak for it because I work for the independent media organization and we do not run ads. The legal pressure is definitely there.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from anyone?
No, I am so sorry. I cannot answer that. In Shawshank Redemption, I would say, yeah, hope is a dangerous thing.
Any other questions? If not, then let's wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us and for all of the insights. I'll put the link again of Collective if people want to visit and get involved. I think in general, the Sun's repressive action will also bring in reactionary responses from various minority groups, and that's also a threat to secularism. And this sort of repression will um, be something that's affecting like everyone from whatever angle they're trying to approach these issues from. But there is still good work happening, and like there is hope for this country, maybe. But
Journalists are still writing stories, so I don't think we should worry. Till people are reporting on stories, there are people who are coming together for a cause. Let's hope we are all here on a Tuesday night. Like more than
yes,
40 people.
exactly. Coming together and organizing is the way forward. So join us also. Thank
you
you
so
so much for your time.